We're seated here in Maury's with some of my students. This is a club at Yale that was founded in 1849, and we're in one of the upstairs rooms here. The place is famous for its singing, but are we going to do any singing? not this time. So this is the 8th and final week of financial markets. And in this week I want to talk about a different kind of finance. It's either public or non-profit. Most of the time we think of finance as financing a company or some private enterprise. But I think a very substantial part of finance is really not to do at all about making profits for some group of people. So public finance is finance for governments. And we have national governments, we have regional governments, and we have municipalities, cities and towns. What's the difference? Well, all of these government agencies are engaged in some kind of business. What's the difference? Sometimes it looks, you'll have a for-profit school and you'll have a public school, and they look kind of similar. They're kind of doing the same thing. It's a subtle, you might say it's a subtle difference, that the voting rights are different. In a corporation, it's one vote per share. In a municipality, it's everyone, every adult gets a vote. But otherwise, it's basically the same. So in my lecture on public and nonprofit finance, I want to try to remind you of just what goes on in public finance. And it's very useful to know something about public finance because it empowers you. You understand how things get done in the government. It's not automatic. Things have to be financed there as in everywhere else. Then there's the other part of this lecture will be about nonprofit finance. So what is a nonprofit company? Well, it's not that they don't make profits, they don't distribute profits. So a nonprofit company exists for some social or environmental purpose. And but again, it might still have to go to the bank and borrow money, and it has to make promises and deliver on those promises, and so it's involved in financing as well. Then there are other kinds of companies that I didn't cover really in this lecture, but let me mention. It's just coming up recently. We're now developing a new kind called a benefit corporation, which is halfway between for-profit and non-profit. So I think that the whole nature of non-profit finance is evolving and changing. And another thing that goes way back is the cooperative. And that's a kind of organization that is not normally thought of as financial, but it's a group gets together for their common purpose and organizes some business activity. But those companies, they're like companies. They have to survive. They'll go and get a loan from a bank like any other company. And so there are subtle differences across these different. But the basic thing I want to say is that they are part of finance too. And so finance is not necessarily about profits, as some people think. Then the next lecture in this section is about, I call it finding your purpose in a world of financial capitalism. Now, I don't know, you may think that it's a good thing or not, what's happened in the last 30 years. We've seen the Soviet Union become a commonwealth of states that are all mostly pretty capitalistic. And China has become, well, it's market socialism, but it looks a little bit more like capitalism to us. All these changes are part of history now, and it makes me feel that my course here is more important than I used to think it was, because now it's part of the world. And the immense growth in standards of living around the world are widely attributed to the growth of financial capitalism. So we're there, and we're going further along those lines. But I think it makes people feel uncomfortable. I know it makes people feel uncomfortable. And that is something I wrote about. Well, when I was delivering the lectures that we're cutting up for this Coursera course, I was writing a book called Finance and the Good Society. It was really all about the conflict that people feel, maybe especially you young people who are launching out on careers. What is the good society? That's an old word, but Walter Lippmann wrote a book called The Good Society in the 1930s. And he said, he didn't define it that clearly to me, but basically it's a society built on the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It seems to have at its core some kind of generosity or selflessness. Now, the golden rule is associated with the Christian religion, but Walter Lippmann, who was Jewish himself, said that's really wrong. It's every religion. Every religion acknowledges some form of that. Human society is built fundamentally on a sense of caring and purpose beyond pure aggrandizement. So that's what the good society is. So how can we have finance as part of the good society? There's a concern as financial capitalism becomes more ubiquitous about the role of finance and power, the role of finance in giving power to certain groups. And there's concern that inequality is getting worse as a result of financial capitalism. But I think that part of what we need to consider is that to some extent it's illusory, and that if people look at financial capitalism with a mature philosophy, as the system matures, it's really not all about profits and wealth. There was a 1910 book which I thought was wonderful by Norman Angell called The Great Illusion. And in that book, what is the Great Illusion? It is the illusion that he thought was widespread around the world at his time, and maybe still is today, that high levels of aggressiveness pay, that going out with a fighting spirit pays off in the long run. Well, some aggressiveness is necessary at all times, but you can exaggerate the importance of aggressiveness. And Angell was worried about World War I, that people were awfully aggressive at the time, and they thought that aggressiveness pays. Well, we learned that excessive aggressiveness doesn't pay. History is filled with examples of overly aggressive behavior ending up in horrible disaster. So I think that people who have thought about finance will think similar things about that too, that ultimately we want to live in a good society. This is kind of a concluding thought for the course, but the thought is that we set up for our civilization sets up for us all a kind of game to play. And we write the rules of the game so that it's a good game. And it gives us some spice in our life, and it puts us on a competitive footing, and things happen when people are competitive. It's what we have something called creative destruction, which is a term that Joseph Schumpeter, where you have to have the tumult of a game in order for things to go well. On the other side, after the game is over, you come back to a place like this, and you get together with your opponents, and we should be generous and kind to each other again. So that's maybe that's the concluding thought before we have our last lectures here about financial capitalism. That there is meaning in a life in business, or even focused on finance, if one takes the right attitude. And this is something that we'll cover in these lectures.